We start with the honorable mentions, and it's quite the crew. Let's begin with Shanley senior receiver and defensive back John Gores. The NDSU commit could probably reach out and catch a 90-mile-per-hour fastball with his football gloves if you asked him to. Gores finished the season with an EDC best 88 catches for 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns. He earned a game ball when he caught a school record 21 passes for 263 and 2 against Jamestown. John was fun to watch this season. There's no stat to quantify attention drawn, but there wasn't a defensive coordinator all year that didn't lose sleep trying to game plan for 16 in green and white. Still, West Fargo senior Carson Hegerly managed to catch 40 passes for 769 yards and 5 touchdowns. The future Bison also shut down half the field on defense and made 3 field goals and 38 extra points. Hegerly played a massive role in getting the Packers to the state championship game. Cheyenne's Josh Heinrich earned his spot on the list by getting 5 yards a carry almost every time he touched the ball, which was 275 times, by the way. Cheyenne's bell cow finished with over 1,400 rushing yards and 23 scores. They rode him in the championship game. Heinrich turned 39 carries into 238 and 3. Hungry Heinrich was a beast. Mandan's Carson Jablonski led the WDA in receiving by a mile, finishing with 55 catches for over 1,000 yards and 7 scores. He also added a couple of kick returns for touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and a couple of forced fumbles as the Braves finished second in the WDA. This next young man was selected as Senior Athlete of the Year, and it's hard to argue. Century's Lucas Schweigert has quite the resume with a couple of state titles and the fact that he's anchored some of the best offensive and defensive lines in state history as a 4-year starter on the O-line and the 3-year starter on the defensive front for the Patriots. The future Fighting Hawk racked up 54 tackles and 2 sacks on defense this fall. Now to our Player of the Year finalists, starting with Shanley running back Aidan DeVine. The Deacon offense is built for big numbers, but even with that in mind, DeVine's season was remarkable. He goes for over 1,300 rushing yards and makes 67 catches for another 540 yards, reaching the end zone 17 times. He was not only the second leading rusher in the state, but he also caught the second most passes in 11AA. A player as tough as nails, and he earns a finalist spot. He'll go head-to-head against the guy who ended up leading the state in rushing with 1,650 yards and 24 touchdowns, West Fargo's Parker Nelson. After the Packers started 1-2, Nelson in the ground game exploded for yards in bulk like they were shopping at Costco. He had 7 straight games of 150-plus rushing yards, including a trio of 230-plus yard games. His offensive line and fullback Josh Balstead played a huge part in the success too, but Nelson also played a critical role on defense when they needed him, making 38 tackles, including 8 tackles for loss. Congrats to Nelson and DeVine on being our 2 finalists. I trimmed my honorable mention list down to 5 in 11A, and it's a solid group, starting with my preseason player of the year, Troy Berg, who left it all on the field for Dickinson this year, leading the team in passing, rushing, and finishing among the top tacklers in the conference, all while facing one of the toughest schedules in 11A. Berg combined for 1,500 yards of offense in his 9 games played, scoring 14 touchdowns. He also added nearly 60 tackles and accounted for 7 turnovers on defense, along with a couple of blocked kicks. Daniel Boutain, quarterback North, to its best season since Y2K was a thing. Kids, look it up. Boutain passed for close to 1,800 yards and combined for 22 scores. He's a leader through and through, and we also learned he's a great trumpet player. He won't toot his own horn, but we will. Isaac Felkley did so much on both sides of the ball for Dan Smeeker's St. Mary's squad. 900 rushing yards and 13 scores to go with over 100 tackles on defense, including 14 for loss. Felkley guided the Saints to their 2nd straight Dakota Bowl appearance. Wahpeton's air raid offense helped the Huskies put up record-setting numbers, and receiver Caden Kappas was a huge beneficiary. It's not too often you see a high school receiver catch 19 touchdown passes. He averaged nearly 2 per game, but he was busy on defense too, making 75 tackles, 8 of them for loss. St. Mary's safety and receiver Britt Senfner recently made a verbal commitment to play football at NDSU, and the Bison are getting quite the talent. Senfner is a 3-year starter, and this is his 2nd year starting both ways. The Coast Senior Athlete of the Year finished with 500 receiving yards and 93 tackles, 12 for loss from his safety spot. He also made some big plays in the state championship game with a touchdown catch and an interception. Now to our pair of finalists. Jamestown receiver and defensive back Adam Kallenbach was the most valuable player on the best team in 11A. He made 42 catches for 719 yards this season to go with the 9 touchdown grabs, most of which were of the highlight reel variety. He did that work with changing faces at quarterback due to injury. Then on defense, he made several game-changing plays with 9 interceptions, many of those turnovers coming in critical spots against tough competition. Kallenbach is a gamer, and he's a finalist for our Player of the Year award. Oddly enough, he never got to face the guy he's facing in the voting. Wahpeton's Blake Schafer, recently named Co-Senior Athlete of the Year, ended up passing for a Class A best and school record, 2,752 yards and 32 touchdowns. He also rushed in 7 more scores. After winning just 1 game his sophomore and junior seasons combined, he led the Huskies to 5 wins and a playoff berth as a senior. I felt going into the season that 11B would be the most competitive, and that's exactly what happened. The state poll was constantly in flux with a crop of great talent, which ended up making my job extremely difficult for this list. Let's give a few of the guys that were on the bubble of making this honorable mention list a shout out. I'm thinking Dean Vetter over at Linton HMB, Zach Hendrickson and Jet Lundeen from Bishop Ryan, Amari Gilmore and Trapper Skolsky from Beulah, Central Cass's Owen Wiersma is another. We start with Owen's squirrel teammate, the Region 1 Senior Athlete of the Year, Jake Deutsch, who caught 41 passes for 891 yards and 16 touchdowns. He also made 51 tackles and intercepted a couple of passes when teams decided that throwing his way was a good idea. From the state runner-up, senior Jace Leshik gets the nod after averaging a whopping 9 yards per carry during his 1,000-yard rushing season. He scored 18 combined touchdowns and was the second leading tackler on one of the best defenses in the state. I know Grafton struggled as a team this year, but Esgar Rio still put up numbers worthy of consideration. Of the 9 opponents on the spoiler schedule, 6 made the playoffs. Still, Rios combined for over 1,000 yards of offense and reached the end zone 12 times. Then on defense, he was busy, making an incredible 103 solo tackles, 21 tackles for loss, including 10 sacks and a pair of picks. He ends his career as a rare 4-time All-State selection. Caleb Rist of Delax Burlington had to shoulder the load for the Lakers after quarterback Carson Yale went down. Rist churned out 1,500 yards and 18 touchdowns to go with solid numbers defensively. Madden Thorson earned Senior Athlete of the Year honors after a senior campaign of 55 catches for 1,100 yards and 14 total touchdowns for Harvey Wells County, a lot of that with teams double-teaming him. He shut down half the field in the passing game every Friday night on defense, too, something that won't pop up on the stat sheet. As for our 2 finalists, we're going with 2 guys that clashed in the state semis. Let's start with Bowman County receiver and safety Clay Heimer. He put up huge numbers in that offense, erupting for 102 catches, 1,500 yards, and 18 end zone trips. He also added 67 tackles from his safety spot. Without Heimer, they don't reach the Final Four. On the other side, junior running back and linebacker Trey Heinrich led Kindred to its first state title, rushing for 1,300 yards on 7 yards a pop. He combined for 28 offensive touchdowns on the season and also dominated defensively, recording 72 tackles, 7 interceptions, and scoring twice on that side of the ball. Heinrich should have the Vikings back in contention next fall. Full disclosure, Class 9B was by far my toughest to make cuts on, so much so that I needed 2 pages of honorable mentions. So I'm going to go through these a little quicker. Wyatt Carabello's monster numbers for Divide County speak for themselves. 20 touchdowns and 14 tackles for loss on the year. Tyson Inget was probably a whisker away from being a Player of the Year finalist. The good news for him, he'll have another shot next year as a senior. Inget passed for 1,000 yards, rushed for 600, and added another 200 through the air, accounting for 33 combined touchdowns. He scored in every way imaginable and had the Outlaws within a touchdown of advancing to the quarters. Grant County Flashers Jace Freeze battled injuries this fall and led the Storm to not 1 but 2 road playoff wins. He also led an offense that scored more points than any other team this year against the state champs LaMoure-Litchville-Marion. Several coaches told me they were super impressed with Cavaliers' Trevor Hinkle this fall. The senior combined for 14 touchdowns on offense and made 128 tackles on defense. Brady Lettenmeyer followed in the footsteps of Brett Wendell nicely for the Lobos. He rushed for 1,800 yards and 23 touchdowns while also making 12 tackles for loss on defense. Lettenmeyer capped off his standout junior year by rushing for 210 and a touchdown in the state championship win. Jace Nelson was the most explosive receiver in the state. He turned nearly half of his 43 catches into touchdowns. He finished with 1,100 receiving yards and averaged an astounding 26 yards per catch. The Outlaws are going to miss him. Nobody ever seemed to learn not to kick it to Dylan Rude of New Salem Almont. He scored 4 times on kick returns and once on a punt. That's not to mention his 16 offensive touchdowns. He was a workhorse for the Holsteins. This next one is an important one. Napoleon Gackle Streeter's Tucker Schneider put up these stats despite going down with an injury in the first half of their 6th game on the schedule. He averaged 320 yards of offense and nearly 5 touchdowns a game. He was on pace for Player of the Year consideration before the injury. And speaking of injury, quick shout out to Wyndmere Lidgerwood's Andrew Arth, who topped 150 yards rushing against both 9-man Dakota Bowl teams before having his season ended prematurely because of injury. Back to Holstein country for Ty Wolding, who passed for 1,200 yards and 19 touchdowns and added 700 rushing yards and 17 more scores. The Holsteins were inches away from playing for a state title. Nathan Kaufman of Mont Regent, New England won a game ball this year. He was a one-man wrecking crew, running, throwing, catching, and tackling for the Wildfire. 2,500 yards of offense and 34 touchdowns. Insert fire emoji. What a season. Now to our 2 finalists for Player of the Year, starting with Chris Jenner. The Surrey running back and defensive end was our preseason Player of the Year, and he delivered an outstanding senior campaign, averaging over a first down per carry en route to 2,300 rushing yards and 24 scores. He was nearly as impressive defensively, finishing with 20 tackles for loss, including 5 sacks. Jenner led the Mustangs into the quarterfinal round, and they were a touchdown away from advancing to the Final Four. His opponent will be the quarterback from the state champs. Corban Potts passed for nearly 1,800 yards and boasted an outstanding touchdown-to-interception ratio of 29-2. That's not even including his 8 rushing scores, 3 of which came in the state championship win. Potts in that offense averaged 50 points per game, and he lost just 1 game as the starting quarterback over the past 2 seasons.